Good morning, you all. It is a beautiful Sunday morning to be spending time here together, and it's really my joy to be here. I want to start off by thanking you for the ways in which some of you have already begun to participate in the giving tree that's out there. There's an opportunity for you to share your resources with people that are here and near and far, and in that far category, you can share gifts and needs with people in Belize and Mexico. And I just want to thank you in advance for any ways that you have or are planning on being involved in that. And I just want to say that there's really no gift too small, that God's been using small gifts for a long time. In the Bible, he talks about he used a little boy's lunch, and he used 5 stones, and he used a widow's mite, and he's used a cup of water. So don't limit yourself in what you think you might have to offer. One time I was giving a talk about generosity and all the things that we have to offer that are in our hand, things that God has made us good at and things that we have in our pockets. And it was there was a 10-year-old boy in the front row, and he raised his hand and interrupted me. And he said, do I have to stay any longer because I'm not really good at anything and I don't have anything in my hand? And I said, you're not good at anything? I'm sure you're good at something. And he's like, no, I'm not actually good at anything. And I said, no, I really bet you're good at something. I have 4 sons. He was not intimidating me with his hand raising. And he said, well, I'm good at Xbox. I said, well, then ask God what he could do with your Xbox. And that satisfied him enough that he sat through the rest of our conversation. But then I stayed in Mexico. My husband and I have lived for 15 years in Mexico as missionaries, and he went back to his Indiana hometown. A couple of weeks after our exchange, he wrote a letter to the Mason, Ohio back-to-back office. And inside of that letter, he enclosed a cashier's check for $410. He had gone back to his elementary school and hosted an Xbox tournament with a $10 entry fee. And he'd had 41 participants in his tournament. He got some local businesses to donate some prizes. And he wrote me a letter telling me exactly where he wanted that money to go. And he said, I guess God can use your Xbox after all. And so in a room full like this, I think about all the ways in which our time and talent and treasure can make an impact this holiday season and people around the world. So thank you on behalf of Back to Back for the ways in which you are doing that. But today, as part of this Christmas around the world, I want to tell you a little bit about what it has been like to celebrate Christmas in Mexico. I am from Ohio, so I have all the traditions that maybe you all do. I grew up on a lake here in Cincinnati, so I ice skated all the time. My parents graduated from Ohio State, so I grew up making Buckeyes this time of year. And probably my family's favorite tradition, which is as awkward as it sounds, is we Christmas carol, which is so fun in the movies, but like in reality, you make people like keep their door open in the middle of winter and listen to you. We are none of us professional singers, awkwardly sing. You know, it is so funny, but it is one of our favorite family traditions. And when we moved to Mexico, we continued all of the same traditions. We just layered on top of them some of the Mexican traditions that came with it. And today, as we talk about this holiday season and all that God has for us, we're going to use this passage out of the book of Luke as a framework for that conversation. The first part of this verse in Luke chapter 14, verse 1, it says, as it happened, Jesus went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath, that they watched him closely. So like oftentimes in Jesus' ministry, he finds himself sitting at a meal, at a table. A lot of his stories happen around tables because that's where life happens. I don't know where you spent Thanksgiving, but around a table, we have a chance to listen to each other. We have a chance to engage. We have a chance to connect. We have a chance to be in each other's presence and to get caught up. So because that's why Jesus came, is to listen and to engage and to be with people. He often framed his stories around tables. I don't know what you'll be having on Christmas, but most Americans have things like turkey and ham on Christmas. But in Mexico, they serve things like tamales, which tamales are wrapped in these corn husks. And yes, the first time someone offered me a tamale, I took a bite into the whole thing, which is so a rookie move because you actually take off that corn husk and eat what's inside of it. So every year after, whatever Mexican I was with who had already heard that would fake like they were going to bite the corn husk and laugh at me. But yes, that was me. But in this particular passage in Luke chapter 14, there's a couple things going on. The day that they were gathering for this meal was called the Sabbath, and the church leaders, the religious people, had all these rules of the ways that we're supposed to spend the Sabbath. And they had brought Jesus to this meal really as a trap because by this point in his life, he was beginning to treat the Sabbath with more freedom than they were, and they didn't like it. It made them feel threatened, and so they brought him there to create a trap so they could catch him and expose him as a lawbreaker. And it says in the original language that the book was written in that they were watching him closely. That verb they use in the Greek means they were watching him with the intent to catch him versus a verb that would mean watching with a sense of curiosity. Do you know the difference between when you're just watching someone out of curiosity and you're watching them with the intent to catch them? I have 4 teenage sons, so I definitely know that difference. Sometimes I look at my sons with curiosity like, really, you're going to eat that entire pizza? Like, does that, like I'm curious, can you actually consume that whole thing? And then sometimes I look at them with the intent to catch them like, do you think you're going to jump off that balcony? Because I'm looking at you right now, and you're not going to jump off that balcony, right? Like that like eyes squinted, head tilted, I am watching you because I expect you to do something wrong. They invited Jesus to this meal because they were expecting him to do something wrong. And even knowing that it was a trap, Jesus experienced all this freedom because he was freedom, because he lived his life understanding that in every moment, every conversation, he had multiple things he was doing at a time. I'm going to tell you a story that is a true story. And it happened, I was here in Cincinnati a number of years ago, speaking at a church down in Mason. And when I was done speaking, they said, just like Drew said in my bio, that I lived in Monterrey, Mexico. This guy comes up to me afterwards, and he's like, Monterrey, Mexico, I know that city. I go there on business. How about the next time I'm there, let's exchange cards. And I don't know, maybe I could take your family out to dinner and you could show me around to your orphanages. And I thought he missed my bio where it said I had 10 children. So yeah, totally you can take me out to dinner. And we exchanged cards, but I had a skirt on with no pockets, and I totally lost his card. I remembered meeting him. I remembered his name was Carlos. I remembered he was going to come to Mexico someday, but that is all I remembered. But he kept my card, and 4 months later, he came into the city. He gave me a call on a Saturday morning to tell me that he was in town and he'd be done around dinner, and would I be willing to come and meet him after his work day, and we could go out to dinner, and then we could show him around to the orphanage. And I totally made plans with Carlos. And then I hung up the phone, and my husband is like, what are you talking about? Carlos who? I'm like, I don't know his last name. Oh, who does he work for? I lost his card. So what are we going to actually do? I had no questions to any of his answers, and that was not okay with him. And meanwhile, as Todd and I, my husband and I, were having this conversation about Carlos, one of the orphanages that we served in had a director whose name was Edgar. And Edgar experienced freedom in God much the same way that God demonstrates in this passage in Luke, that it doesn't matter who is watching, that we can love and be and do as God wills and not worry about what's around us. And he woke up that day, he was the director of a children's home with 50 children, and he woke up that day with not enough money to serve them food twice that day, which was their typical custom, to eat twice on a Saturday. He did have enough money in his petty cash, in his caja chica, we call it, to buy brunch, which they ate that Saturday, about 50 kids. But after that meal was over, he had no more money and no more food. He should have called me. That's the whole reason I was a missionary there. I was there for that very reason. If he would have called me and said, hey, we've run out of money and we've run out of food and I got 50 kids I got to feed, I would have happily run him over. A basket full of beans and rice and eggs and oil and tortilla, food I could have gotten in bulk and pretty cheap, and that would have sustained them till we could have gotten them better resources. But Edgar was beginning to get afraid that those kids were putting us in a place only God belongs. God is the giver of all good gifts, the Bible teaches us, not people. When you give a gift off of that giving tree, yes, it'll be your hands and your time and your wrapping paper and your effort. But when the recipient receives it, they'll be grateful to God for what it is that you gave them. And he was beginning to be afraid that the kids were seeing us in that place. So instead of calling us, he just spent the day praying, asking God that he would bring dinner that night. Meanwhile, Todd and I are continuing to have this discussion about Carlos, and he goes, I'm not having you take all the kids, and we're not going down there for something I don't understand what it is. I will go down and meet Carlos. I'll figure out what he's up to, and if it's worth all of us coming out. And I said, okay. So he goes down to where Edgar had given me an address, and he calls me a little bit later. He said, don't come down. It's not worth it. He said, he's here and he's got a bunch of product and I'm just going to put it in the back of the truck and I'm going to drive it around. And I said, okay. Back at that children's home, it was dinner time. And Edgar called all of those 50 kids back around the table. And they tell me later that when he called them to dinner and nothing smelled very good, it was kind of confusing to them. But he gathered them around the table and he said, hey, I just want to let you know that we're going to pray right now and ask God for the dinner that we don't have yet, but I believe we can trust him for it. And the kids thought that was weird, but they were hungry. So they all bowed their heads and they began to pray. And one of the boys at that table was 4 years old. So I don't know if you've ever been in a prayer time with a 4-year-old, but he didn't last very long. About 2 seconds after they began praying, he raised his hand and he was like, Tio, which is what you say in Spanish for uncle. Tio, 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 Tio. He was interrupting that meal. He was calling out to Edgar. He's like, Tio, I was just wondering, we're asking God to bring us dinner. And Edgar was looking for a teachable moment. So he stopped the whole prayer and he's like, yes, Joel, we're asking God to bring us dinner. And Joel's like, what kind of dinner does God bring you? And Edgar goes, I don't have any idea, but we're going to trust him for it. They bow their heads, they continue to pray, but Joel's little brain was going crazy, and he raised his hand a few seconds later, and he's like, Tio, 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 Tio. And everybody's like, what? And he's like, I bet if he's God, I bet he brings us meat. And Edgar goes, well, we can pray for some meat. That's great, because they have a lot of beans and rice in their orphanage. So they close their eyes, and somebody begins to pray for some meat, and Joel, for the third time, interrupts them all. He's like, Tio, 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 Tio. What kind of meat do you think God's going to bring us? And Edgar goes, the Bible tells us that he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know you're some of his most favorite children. I have no idea what kind of meat he's going to bring us, but let's ask that he does it. So they're all praying. We don't know about this. When Todd calls me to tell me that they had this leftover product, I said, I would love to come see what they're doing. He's like, Beth, he's down here at the meat convention. He works for the John Morrell Meat Company. And he said he has tons of leftover product that he brought from Dry County down here, and he can't go back the other direction across the border. And so it's just going to go to waste. And it's way more than we have room in our deep freezer. I'm just going to stick it in the back of the truck, and he's got some other vendors who are going to give us some of their product too. I'm just going to drive around to the 8 children's homes that we serve. Would you call ahead and let them all know I'm on my way with the donation? And I said, sure. So the first children's home I called was Edgar. He's only 8 blocks from the convention center. So I pick up the phone, I'm like, Edgar, just calling to see if you guys are around tonight. Todd's on his way over with the donation. And he goes, yeah, we're around tonight. I said, oh, great. He'll be right over. And as I'm getting ready to hang up, he said, do you know what he's bringing? And I said, I don't really know much about it. I know that he's at a meat convention, and he wanted me to make sure you have some room in your freezer. And he goes, I got some room in my freezer. And I said, okay, great. Talk to you later. Because I'm thinking I got 7 more phone calls to make. So I'm getting ready to hang up the phone. And Edgar, who's a dear friend of mine, he was like, Beth. I'm sorry to say this, but would you mind finding out exactly what kind of meat is on its way over? I'm thinking, we are in the orphan business. We are not that picky. If it goes in a freezer, it goes in a child's mouth. But I put my best missionary voice on. I'm like, sure, Edgar, I'll get right back to you. So I hang up the phone with Edgar. I pick up the phone, I call Todd. I'm like, hey, I don't know what's going on with Edgar, but he'd like to know exactly what it is you're bringing over to him. And he said, Beth, it's just like they're trying to attract some restaurant business. The city that we lived in was 6 million people. He's like, it's the most incredible cuts of filet mignon and New York strip and T-bone and sirloin. And he's like, I don't even know if they know how to fix it, but I'm on my way over with it. And I'm like, okay. So I hang up the phone with Todd, and I'm like, hey, Edgar, it's like this grade A, USDA, all the letters you want with your meat, incredible cuts of filet mignon and New York strip and T-bone and sirloin. I just want to know, do you got room in your freezer for any of that? And at that point, he tells me what had been going on in his orphanage for almost an hour at that point. And then he pulls the phone away from his mouth and he yells to the kids, hey, kids, God's on his way over with your steak. and I love that story for 2 reasons. One, man, I think God has a big plan in store for that little boy that he decided to teach him at age 4, that the Bible teaches it takes the faith the size of a mustard seed to move a mountain. That it's not designed on anything we bring to the table. Man, we get that confused. We think it's about who we are and what we say and what we do and what we have and what we believe in. That's not the way that God set this whole thing up. You can't get any faith smaller than a 4-year-old orphan. It's like literally the smallest measure of faith you can get. But God decided to do big things through a small child who trusted in him. And that is a good lesson for us today. But I also love that story because I am not like Edgar. I don't like to get my back up against the wall. When I find myself with my back up against the wall, my first temptation is often to call out to man. And what happens when you call out to man? You get things like beans and rice and eggs and oil and tortilla, which feels like it fills you up, but the truth of the matter is it's pretty cheap. That God is telling us from the very beginning, trust me in this. I see you. I know every one of your needs. invite me to the table. You have no idea what I want to do. I am for you. I am with you. I hear you. I see you. There's freedom and confidence in that kind of faith. It goes on in that passage to say, behold, there was a man before them who had dropsy. Dropsy is just a description of water in the face. It's a disease that means that you could see it right away when someone had dropsy because they were very bloated in the face. And here is the trap that they set before him. They wondered if Jesus, the healer, could sit at a table with someone who so totally needed his touch and then break a law that they thought you weren't supposed to do things like heal on the Sabbath. And so if he healed this person on the Sabbath, then he was breaking the law. And if he didn't heal somebody on the Sabbath, then he was heartless. And they were waiting to see what God was going to do. But I tell you, God sees so much more than just what we see with our eyes. Yes, that person at the table absolutely needed touch because he had a disease. But God was looking at the Pharisees who needed a touch from him as well, who were feeling bound and confused probably by what they had been taught. And he wanted to do more than just heal the man with dropsy. He wanted to free the people who were bound by by their thinking. I don't know if you've ever seen someone that needed physical healing and you've wondered what you're supposed to do. In my work with orphan and vulnerable children, I often see the kinds of scars not visible by the eye, the kinds of wounds that go down deep. And I believe that God wants to involve us in stories of healing, sometimes physical healing and oftentimes in emotional healing. We adopted a son several years ago who was a teenager, and we didn't know exactly when he was going to come home during the 2-year process, but as it happened to be, he came home 30 days before we had an already scheduled family vacation. So it's not really a good idea to take a teenager who's new to the country to a place where you have no predictable routine and no lifelines, but off we went to Colorado. And the week went much better than I thought it would, except for the very last night. We were playing a Monopoly game as a family, and his brothers were trading properties and taxing each other and making trades and all the things you do in Monopoly. And they began to laugh with each other, and he misunderstood something and thought they were laughing at him. And it was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, and he started getting upset and then crying, and I excused him from the table. I knew he was overstimulated, he was overwhelmed, overtired. I took him down into his room and basically tucked him in and said, good night, tomorrow's a new day. And I was sure he was going to fall asleep like that, but not my best mom moment, he didn't. And about an hour later, one of my sons came up and he's like, hey, you know Tyler's down there still crying, don't you? I was like, oh man, I did not know that. I went down there, and when we start crying about one incident and we allow ourselves, this is why so many of us don't want to cry, because what can happen is as that heart begins to express what is held in reserve, he started, crying about Park Place, but over not very many minutes, he began to grieve all kinds of things about his story and his transition. And I there's no way I could fix it by telling him, next time you can buy hotels, I promise. This was going to be solved. This wasn't going to be solved. This was just going to be comforted. And God wanted to partner with me in offering comfort to him. So I just sat there with him and said things that I knew to be true, like we love you, and we came for you, and we're not going anywhere, and I love you. We're here. Finally, he calmed down, and he fell asleep. And the next day, we were flying back to Cincinnati. My husband circled everybody up, and he said, what was your favorite moment of the week? And all the rest of my children named the kinds of things that cost us money to do. And everyone was waiting to see what Tyler would say because everything was new to him that week. Climbed his first mountain, fished out of his first river, rode his first horse. Like, what was going to be your big moment? And when it was his turn, what was your favorite moment of the week? He's like, oh, by far my favorite moment of the week is when Mom told me last night how much she loved me. And I realized in that moment, my gosh, we learn those kinds of things about people when we sit with them and engage with them and listen to them and connect them and follow this example that Jesus sets in this mealtime. We hear and can exchange and express the heart of God with and through other people. And as Jesus puts his finger on this very conflict, this very trap, and says, do you think it's lawful if I heal on the Sabbath? Do you think it's lawful to heal on the Sabbath? He's exposing their thinking, because again, if they say yes, it's lawful, then they look like they're breaking the law. And no, it's not lawful. They look like they're heartless. And everybody knew they couldn't heal anybody anyway. And as I was thinking about this passage, I was just thinking about, is there a way, is there a time sometime when you've ever wondered, what's the right thing to do here? Not like, this is the right thing to do and I just don't want to do it. Not that kind of torn. I know what that feels like. But have you ever been in a situation where, like these Pharisees were, where they're, I don't think their intention was very good, but I do think they found themselves in a quandary, what way is right? Have you ever been confused in those kinds of ways? And so I was trying to think of an example, and the example I came up with is actually pretty